Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Tragedy of Liberation, A History of the Chinese Revolution, 1945 to 1957, by Frank Dikötter. Narrated by Bruce Mann. Publisher's note: this audiobook refers to tables included in the print and e-book editions of the book. Win over the majority, oppose the minority, and crush all enemies separately. Mao Zedong. Preface. The Chinese Communist Party refers to its victory in 1949 as a liberation. The term brings to mind jubilant crowds taking to the streets to celebrate their newly won freedom, but in China, the story of liberation and the revolution that followed is not one of peace, liberty, and justice. It is first and foremost a history of calculated terror and systematic violence. The Second World War in China had been a bloody affair, but the Civil War from 1945 to 1949 also claimed hundreds of thousands of civilian lives, not counting military casualties. As the communists tried to wrest the country from Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, they laid siege to one city after another, starving them into submission. Changchun, in the middle of the vast Manchurian plain north of the Great Wall of China, was blockaded for 5 months in 1948. Lin Biao, the commander in charge of the communist troops, ordered that it be turned into a city of death. He placed sentries every 50 meters along a perimeter around the city and prohibited starving civilians from leaving, putting more pressure on the grain reserves of the nationalists. People tried to survive by eating grass, insects, and tree bark. A few turned to human flesh. Anti-aircraft guns and heavy artillery bombarded the city day and night. At least 160,000 people died of hunger and disease during the siege. A few months later, the People's Liberation Army moved into Beijing unopposed. Other cities also fell without firing a shot, unwilling to endure a prolonged blockade. In parts of the country, sympathetic crowds even welcomed the communists, relieved that the war had come to an end and hopeful of a better future. Across the country, people accepted liberation with a mixture of fear, hope, and resignation. In the countryside, land reform followed liberation. Farmers were given a plot of land in exchange for overthrowing their leaders. Violence was an indispensable feature of land distribution, implicating a majority in the murder of a carefully designated minority. Work teams were given quotas of people who had to be denounced, humiliated, beaten, dispossessed, and then killed by the villagers, who were assembled in their hundreds in an atmosphere charged with hatred. In a pact sealed in blood between the party and the poor, close to 2 million so-called landlords, often hardly any better off than their neighbors, were liquidated. From Hebei, Liu Shaoqi, the second-in-command, reported that some of them had been buried alive, tied up and dismembered, shot or throttled to death. Some children were slaughtered as little landlords. Less than a year after liberation came a Great Terror, designed to eliminate all the enemies of the party. Mao handed down a killing quota of 1 per 1,000, but in many parts of the country, 2 or 3 times as many people were executed, often on the flimsiest of pretexts. Entire villages were razed to the ground. School children as young as 6 were accused of spying for the enemy and tortured to death. Sometimes cadres simply picked a few prisoners at random and had them shot to meet their quota. By the end of 1951, close to 2 million people had been murdered, sometimes during public rallies in stadiums, but more often than not, away from the public eye, in forests, ravines, beside rivers, alone or in batches. A vast network of prisons scattered across the length and breadth of the country swallowed up many more. Violence was the revolution, to paraphrase Simon Schama's observation about the French Revolution. But violence needed to be inflicted only occasionally to be effective. Fear and intimidation were its trusted companions, and they were widely used. People were encouraged to transform themselves into what the communists called new people. Everywhere, in government offices, factories, workshops, schools, and universities, they were re-educated and made to study newspapers and textbooks, learning the right answers, the right ideas, and the right slogans. While the violence abated after a few years, thought reform never ended, as people were compelled to scrutinize their every belief, suppressing the transitory impressions that might reveal hidden bourgeois thoughts behind a mask of socialist conformity. Again and again, in front of assembled crowds or in study sessions under strict supervision, they had to write confessions, denounce their friends, justify their past activities, and answer queries about their political reliability. One victim called it a carefully cultivated Auschwitz of the mind. Yet much of the regime was founded on far more than mere violence and intimidation. The history of communism in China is also a history of promises made and promises broken. The communists wanted to woo before they tried to control. Like Lenin and the Bolsheviks, Mao achieved power by promising every disaffected group what they wanted most: land for the farmers, independence for all minorities, freedom for intellectuals, protection of private property for businessmen, higher living standards for the workers. The Chinese Communist Party rallied a majority under the banner of the New Democracy, a slogan promising cooperation with all except the most hardened enemies of the regime. Under the facade of a united front, a number of non-communist organizations, such as the Democratic Party, were co-opted into power, although they remained under the leadership of the Communist Party. One by one, these promises were broken. Mao was a master of strategy: win over the majority, oppose the minority, and crush all enemies separately. One by one, a whole range of opponents were eliminated with the unwitting help of the enemies of tomorrow, those who were cajoled into cooperating with the authorities. Immediately after the Bloody Terror of 1951, the regime turned against the former government servants it had asked to stay on a few years earlier. Their services no longer needed, over 1 million of them were sacked from their jobs or thrown in jail. The business community was attacked in 1952. Entrepreneurs were dragged to denunciation meetings, where they had to confront their employees who were worked up into a fever pitch of hatred, real or feigned. In a mere 2 months, more than 600 entrepreneurs, businessmen, and shopkeepers killed themselves in Shanghai alone. Many others were ruined. Everything that stood between the entrepreneur and the state was eliminated. All existing laws and judicial organs were abolished, replaced by a legal system inspired by the Soviet Union. Free speech was curtailed. Independent courts were replaced by people's tribunals. Autonomous chambers of commerce were taken over by local branches of the state-controlled All China Federation of Industry and Commerce. In 1956, the government expropriated all private enterprises, whether small shops or large industries, under the so-called redemption purchase policy, although the policy entailed neither purchase nor redemption. In the countryside, despite fierce resistance to collectivization and the devastation it produced, in 1956 farmers lost their tools, their land, and their livestock. They also lost their freedom of movement and were compelled to sell their grain to the state at prices mandated by the state. They became bonded laborers at the beck and call of local cadres. Already by 1954, by the admission of the regime itself, farmers had a third less food to eat compared to the years before liberation. Almost everybody in the countryside was on a starvation diet. When Mao turned against intellectuals in 1957, sending 500,000 of them to the Gulag, it was the culmination of a series of drives by the party to eliminate all opposition, whether it came from ethnic minorities, religious groups, farmers, artisans, entrepreneurs, industrialists, teachers and scholars, or doubters within the ranks of the party itself. After a decade of communist rule, there was hardly anybody left to oppose the chairman. But even as every promise was broken, the party kept on gaining followers. Many were idealists, some were opportunists, others thugs. They displayed astonishing faith and almost fanatical conviction, sometimes even after they themselves had ended up being devoured by the party machinery. A few party intellectuals purged in 1957 actually volunteered to work in the great northern wilderness, a vast swamp infested with mosquitoes where prisoners were sent to reclaim wasteland. They saw it as an opportunity to redeem themselves and seek self-renewal in the hope of being allowed to serve the party again. Is there any good that the Chinese communists have done? Valentin Chu asked in a landmark book entitled The Inside Story of Communist China, published a decade after the communist conquest. His answer was that a single act or a single program, when isolated from the broader picture, may very well have been invaluable. A dam that worked, a nursery where children fared well, a prison where the inmates were treated humanely. The campaign to eliminate illiteracy in the countryside was laudable until it was given up. But, when seen in the overall context of what happened to the country between 1949 and 1957, these isolated achievements did not amount to a broad trend towards equality, justice, and freedom, the proclaimed values of the regime itself. People from all walks of life were caught up in this huge tragedy, and they are at the heart of this book. Their experiences have often been silenced, not least by the official propaganda that produced a seemingly endless flow of pronouncements from the leadership. The propaganda was about the world in the making, not about the reality on the ground. It was a world of plans, blueprints, and models, featuring model workers and model peasants, not the real people of flesh and blood. Historians, too, have sometimes confused the abstract world presented by propaganda with the complicated individual tragedies of revolution, buying all too readily into the gleaming image that the regime so carefully projected to the rest of the world. Some have called the years of liberation a golden age or a honeymoon period, in contrast to the cataclysm of the Cultural Revolution that started in 1966. On a more popular level, keepers of the faith continue to portray the Chinese Revolution as one of the greatest events in world history, all the more so as other communist dictators, Russia's Joseph Stalin, Cambodia's Pol Pot, and North Korea's Kim Il-sung, have lost much of their credibility. But, as this book shows, the first decade of Maoism was one of the worst tyrannies in the history of the 20th century, sending to an early grave at least 5 million civilians and bringing misery to countless more. The bulk of the evidence presented in this book comes from party archives in China. Over the past few years, vast amounts of material have become available, and I draw on hundreds of previously classified documents, including secret police reports, unexpurgated versions of important leadership speeches, confessions extracted during thought reform campaigns, inquiries into rebellions in the countryside, detailed statistics on the victims of the Great Terror, surveys of working conditions in factories and workshops, letters of complaint written by ordinary people, and much more. Other sources include personal memoirs, letters, and diaries, as well as eyewitness accounts from people who lived through the revolution. Sympathizers of the regime have unjustly discarded many of the claims of these earlier eyewitnesses, but these can now be corroborated by archival evidence, giving them a new lease of life. Taken as a whole, these sources offer us an unprecedented opportunity to probe beyond the shiny surface of propaganda and retrieve the stories of the ordinary men and women who were both the main protagonists and the main victims of the revolution. The Tragedy of Liberation is the second volume of the People's Trilogy. It precedes chronologically an earlier volume, Mao's Great Famine, which looks at the man-made catastrophe that claimed tens of millions of lives between 1958 and 1962. A third and final volume on the Cultural Revolution will follow in due course. The nature of the archival evidence that underpins the People's Trilogy is explained in greater detail in an essay on the sources in Mao's Great Famine. Part 1. Conquest, 1945 to 1949. 1. Siege. When workers in Changchun started digging trenches for a new irrigation system in the summer of 2006, they made a gruesome discovery. The rich black soil was clogged with human remains. Below a meter of earth were thousands of skeletons closely packed together. When they dug deeper, the workers found several more layers of bones stacked up like firewood. A crowd of local residents gathered around the excavated area was taken aback by the sheer size of the burial site. Some thought that the bodies belonged to victims of the Japanese occupation during the Second World War. Nobody, except an elderly man, realized that they had just stumbled on remnants of the civil war that had resumed after 1945 between Mao Zedong's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. In 1948, the communists had laid siege to Changchun for 5 months, starving out a nationalist garrison stationed inside the city walls. Victory came at a heavy cost. At least 160,000 civilians died of hunger during the blockade. After liberation, the communist troops buried many of the bodies in mass graves without so much as a tombstone, a nameplate, or even a simple marker. After decades of propaganda about the peaceful liberation of China, few people remember the victims of the Communist Party's rise to power. Changchun, in the middle of the vast Manchurian plain north of the Great Wall of China, was a minor trading town before the arrival of the railway in 1898. It developed rapidly as the junction between the South Manchurian Railway, run by the Japanese, and the Chinese Eastern Railway, owned by the Russians. In 1932, Changchun became the capital of Manchukuo, a puppet state of Imperial Japan, which installed Henry Poe, later known as the Last Emperor, as its Manchu ruler. The Japanese transformed the city into a modern, wheel-shaped city with broad avenues, shade trees, and public works. Large cream-colored buildings for the imperial bureaucracy appeared beside spacious parks, while elegant villas were built for local collaborators and their Japanese advisors. In August 1945, the Soviet army took over the city and, so far as they could, dismantled the factories, machines, and materials, sending the war booty back by the trainload to the Soviet Union. industrial installations were demolished, and many of the formerly handsome houses were stripped bare. The Soviets stayed until April 1946, when the Nationalist Army took over the city. 2 months later, the Civil War began, and Manchuria once again became a battlefield. The Communist armies had the initiative and moved down from the north, cutting the railway that connected Changchun with nationalist strongholds further south. In April 1948, the Communists advanced towards Changchun itself. Led by Lin Biao, a gaunt man who had trained at the Whampoa Military Academy, they laid siege to the city. Lin was considered one of the best battlefield commanders and a brilliant strategist. He was also ruthless. When he realized that Zheng Dongguo, the defending commander in Changchun, would not capitulate, he ordered the city to be starved into submission. On the 30th of May 1948 came his command: turn Changchun into a city of death. Inside Changchun were some 500,000 civilians, many of them refugees who had fled the communist advance and were trapped in their journey south to Beijing after the railway lines had been cut. 100,000 nationalist troops were also garrisoned inside the city. Curfew was imposed almost immediately, keeping people indoors from 8 at night to 5 in the morning. All able-bodied men were made to dig trenches. Nobody was allowed to leave. People who refused to be searched by sentries were liable to be shot on the spot. Yet an air of goodwill still prevailed in the first weeks of the siege, as emergency supplies were dropped by air. Some of the well-to-do even established a Changchun mobilization committee, supplying sweets and cigarettes, comforting the wounded, and setting up tea stalls for the men. But soon the situation deteriorated. Changchun became an isolated island, beleaguered by some 200,000 communist troops, who dug tunnel defenses and cut off the underground water supply to the city. 24 anti-aircraft guns and heavy artillery bombarded the city all day long, concentrating their fire on government buildings. The nationalists built 3 defensive lines of pillboxes around Changchun. Between the nationalists and the communists lay a vast no-man's land, soon taken over by bandits. On the 12th of June 1948, Chiang Kai-shek cabled an order reversing the ban on people leaving the city. Even without enemy fire, his planes could not possibly parachute in enough supplies to meet the needs of an entire city. But the anti-aircraft artillery of the communists forced them to fly at an altitude of 3,000 meters. Many of the airdrops landed outside the area controlled by the nationalists. In order to prevent a famine, the nationalists encouraged the populace to head for the countryside. Once they had left, they were not allowed back, as they could not be fed. Every departing refugee was subject to rigorous inspection. Metallic objects such as pots or pans, as well as gold and silver, and even salt, seen as a vital commodity, were prohibited. Then the refugees had to cross the no-man's land, a dark and dangerous terrain dominated by gangs, usually army deserters, who preyed on the defenseless crowds. Many had guns and even horses, some used passwords. The most skillful refugees managed to conceal a piece of jewelry, a watch or a fountain pen, but those found to be hiding an earring or a bracelet in the seam of their clothing risked being shot. Sometimes all their clothes were snatched. A few saved their best belongings by bundling them deep inside a burlap bag filled with dirty rags, including urine-soaked baby clothes, in the hope that the smell would repel robbers. Few ever made it past the communist lines. Lin Biao had placed a sentry every 50 meters along barbed wire and trenches 4 meters deep. Every exit was blocked. He reported to Mao, We don't allow the refugees to leave and exhort them to turn back. This method was very effective in the beginning, but later the famine got worse, and starving civilians would leave the city in droves at all times of day and night, and after we turned them down, they started gathering in the area between our troops and the enemy. Lin described how desperate the refugees were to be allowed through communist lines, explaining that they knelt in front of our troops in large groups and begged us to let them through. Some left their babies and small children with us and absconded. Others hanged themselves in front of sentry posts. The soldiers who saw this misery lost their resolve, some even falling on their knees to weep with the starving people, saying, "We are only following orders." Others covertly allowed some of them through. After we corrected this, another tendency was discovered, namely the beating, tying up and shooting of refugees by soldiers, some to death. We do not as yet have any numbers for those injured or beaten to death. Half a century later, Wang Jinru explained what had happened when he was a soldier. We were told they were the enemy and they had to die. Wang was 15 when the communists forced him to enroll in the army. During the siege, he joined the other soldiers ordered to drive back hungry civilians. By the end of June, some 30,000 people were caught in the area between the communists, who would not allow them to pass, and the nationalists, who refused to let them back into the city. Hundreds died every day. 2 months later, more than 150,000 civilians were pressed inside the death zone, reduced to eating grass and leaves, doomed to slow starvation. Dead bodies were strewn everywhere, their bellies bloated in the scorching sun. The pungent stench of decomposition was everywhere, remembered one survivor. The situation inside the city was little better. Besides the airdrops for the garrison, some 330 tons of grain were required daily to feed the civilians, although at best 84 tons were delivered by 4 or 5 planes, and often much less. Everything was requisitioned in the defense of Changchun. Chiang Kai-shek even prohibited private trading in August, threatening to shoot any merchant who contravened his order. Soon the nationalist soldiers turned on the civilians, stealing their food at gunpoint. They slaughtered all the army horses, then dogs, cats, and birds. Ordinary people ate rotten sorghum and corn cobs before stripping the bark from trees. Others ate insects or leather belts. A few turned to human flesh, sold at $1.20 a pound on the black market. Cases of collective suicide occurred all the time. Entire families killed themselves to escape from the misery. Dozens died by the roadside every day. "We were just lying in bed, starving to death," said Zhang Yinghua when interviewed about the famine that claimed the lives of her brother, her sister, and most of her neighbors. "We couldn't even crawl." Song Zhanlin, another survivor, remembered how she passed a small house with the door ajar. "I entered to have a look and saw a dozen bodies lying all over the place, on the bed and on the floor. Among those on the bed, one was resting his head on a pillow, and a girl was still embracing a baby. It looked as if they were asleep. The clock on the wall was still ticking away." Autumn saw temperatures plunge, and the survivors struggled to stay warm. They stripped floorboards, rooftops, sometimes entire buildings in the search for fuel. Trees were chopped down, even signboards were pilfered for wood. Asphalt was ripped from the streets. Like a slow-moving implosion, the gradual destruction of the city started in the suburbs and gradually rippled towards the center. In the end, 40% of the housing went up in smoke. Heavy bombardment by artillery at point-blank range added to the misery, as ordinary people sheltered in shanties strewn with debris and decomposing bodies, while the nationalist top brass took refuge behind the massive concrete walls of the Central Bank of China. Soldiers absconded throughout.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?